We are Tutorial 2 Group 2, and this is Western Sydney Airport, a case project review. Western Sydney Airport was designed to be Sydney's second airport, located in Badgerys Creek in Sydney's west, as initially identified in 1986. The project is expected to commence operation by 2027, with an expected final capacity of up to 10 million passengers every year. The case project presentation will be broken up into 4 PMBOK areas of management: cost, covered by myself; schedule, covered by Jonathan; scope, covered by Adrian; and stakeholder, covered by Michael. This will then be followed by a brief general reflection and evaluation, as well as references. The first portion of the project to be reviewed is cost management. The key cost management challenges faced by the case project were cost scope management and integration, estimation and communication of project costs, and management of key decision timing, understanding the cost of inaction. The approaches used to manage each of these challenges were collaboration with government partners to identify both physical and management overheads and areas of overlapping interest, reviewing of estimates and proposals of more realistic valuations and budgets that would allow the achievement of the desired outcome, and heavy initial investigation and research into possible decisions potentially impacted by opportunity cost. The key cost management successes of the project are grouped into 2 main items: integration of infrastructure and the identification of opportunity cost. The relevant PMBOK principles for infrastructure integration are planned cost management, achieved by defining a cost-sharing strategy early on; cost estimation, where the non-direct infrastructure costs were separated from the project; and budget determination, by clear allocation of infrastructure costs to broader government programs. While those for opportunity cost identification are recognition of opportunity cost, where the actual economic impact of delay was quantified; realization of benefits, where the larger role of the project accounted for long-term impacts; and reduction of cost estimate variance, whereby identifying multiple possible delay scenarios allowed for different estimated costs. The infrastructure integrations are divided into road improvements and rail infrastructure, both of which would be necessary to ensure efficient connectivity of the new airport with the rest of Sydney. While the road improvements may seem more indirect, since the total of $3.84 billion in improvement also benefits the surrounding areas, and not solely the airport, what would be costs directly attributed to the airport were combined into a greater involvement and improvement project, removing the cost burden from the airport project itself. The rail infrastructure improvements, however, are much more direct. With additional stations being placed on the way to the airport, the main purpose of the project is still to connect the airport with the rest of Sydney's rail network. That being said, the direct cost of 2 stations and an airport rail bridge that are being built on the airport's footprint are taken on by the Metro project instead, incurring a direct savings of up to $1.9 billion. By collaborating with other government projects and initiatives, areas of overlap were identified and collaborated on. A potential improvement to this approach could be a more clear communication of the areas of overlap in the actual project reporting, and showing what costs in each project were there for those overlap areas. Regarding the success for opportunity cost identification, it stems back to the initial 2012 planning report for the project that correctly identified the opportunity cost of not commencing the necessary land acquisitions, environmental, economic, and other impact studies. The report identified that a delay would result in potential foregone direct economic activity of $5.1 billion in expenditure for New South Wales and $4.7 billion for Australia over the period to 2035. This is in addition to the greater $59.5 billion in foregone expenditure for New South Wales and $34 billion in foregone gross domestic product from 2011 to 2060. When adjusted for inflation, these values escalate to nearly $7.6 billion for New South Wales and nearly $7 billion for Australia to 2035. And for 2026, $88.3 billion for New South Wales and $50.4 billion for Australia's GDP. Another important aspect of the cost management that directly links to opportunity cost is the realized value of the project, which for a project of this scale includes the economic value of the jobs created. The initial report in 2012 estimated that the foregone jobs for delaying the project increased exponentially to a total of 57,000 in New South Wales and nearly 78,000 nationwide in just 2060. As shown in the graph from the report, the foregone employment rate increase is tied directly to the estimated start of operation. In contrast, the estimated created jobs during construction and 2 stages of operation between 2031 and 2041, when compared to the expected foregone jobs, shows that approximately 33,000 more jobs are set to be created than estimated to be foregone. The approach of identifying these potential opportunity costs early on in the project allowed for the impact of the project being clear, and once more data was available, comparing the generated jobs and in the future economic value, allowing for reflection on project goals. The potential improvement for this is to ensure that follow-up research is undertaken during the project to identify if opportunity risks have changed, and if so, review any changes in strategy that may be needed. With the successes of the project identified, the next step is to identify the key project failures, with the first one being a systemic underestimation of costs. For the underestimation of costs, the Pumbach principles that were deviated from were the estimate costs, where there was a failure to present accurate and credible estimates to shareholders and decision makers, determined budget, with large differences and discrepancies between the estimated cost and later allocated funds, and cost baseline integrity, whereby having baselines based on incorrect or non-accurate information did not allow for proper progress tracking. The second key project failure regarded a land acquisition scandal, where the Pumbach principles that were deviated were cost-risk optimization, where risks were overstated and a lack of alternative solutions were investigated, procurement cost management, whereas insufficient due diligence was carried out, in addition to non-inclusion of critical information to decision makers. The third being control costs, where there was a lack of independent verification and no further confirmation on proposed values. The underestimation of costs for the project can be demonstrated by comparing the 2012 Joint Report's estimate to the budget allocated in 2017. The estimated cost for completion of Stage 1 was $2.4 billion, while the federal budget allocation in 2017 was for $5.3 billion over the next 10 years. When accounting for inflation, the 2012 estimate would be roughly $2.65 billion in 2017, when the budget of $5.3 million was allocated, a difference at the time of $2.66 billion, over 100% more than estimated, with a minimal percentage difference seen in 2025. The discrepancy in cost estimate compared to the allocated budget does not allow for accurate tracking of the project progress from its proposal. Assuming the project finishes within budget and by deadline, which would be a success, if compared the initial estimate used to determine the feasibility of the project would have an estimated cost at completion of 0.5, bringing the accuracy and trustworthiness of a completion within budget to question. While this management approach could be suitable, it could be improved by having more clear communication with stakeholders on the reasonings behind changes to estimates or budgets. Price only 11 months later. The report identified that there was insufficient due diligence during its valuation, where the importance of land was overstated, and the risk of not purchasing the parcel at the time was also overstated and not properly assessed. The audit also found that the initial valuation was conducted by a valuer recommended by the landowner, where it was incorrectly assumed that there was no conflict of interest, as well as the purchase price and existing market valuations of the parcels being omitted while presenting the acquisition to the decision makers. This case showed that the management approach used to identify opportunity risk can falter for items that are outside the initial heavy research, and why the recommended review improvement could have avoided this issue.
Hi, I'm Jonathan, and I'll be detailing the schedule management for West Sydney Airport. According to the Project Management Body of Knowledge 7th edition, schedule management is focused on creating a delivery cadence that ensures timely completion of project deliverables, while adapting to uncertainty and stakeholder needs. A key success for the schedule management is the completion of one of the largest earth-moving projects in Australian history, moving 22 million cubic metres of earth on schedule. With the early appointment of Betchel as delivery partner and project manager, high-level scheduling oversight and the use of stage contract awards were utilised to ensure earthworks were finished before the terminal construction began. The top-down approach was the most appropriate for the distribution of earth around the northwest and southwest sections of the airport because it decomposed major deliverables into smaller components. Centralised control of the scheduling decisions maximised fast tracking, allowing for the aviation infrastructure activities in the east to commence before the site preparation in the northwest and southwest have been completed. This would not have been possible if project management occurred through team members. However, whilst no catastrophic scheduling failures occurred, there was a notable sequencing gap where airport construction advanced far earlier whilst the Metrolink was still in approvals, creating challenges in aligning delivery timelines. The airport entered major construction from 2019, while the metro remained in planning, approvals, and procurement until 2022. This created a 3-year delivery maturity gap, where the physical site formation and design decisions progressed ahead of confirmed rail delivery, contributing to ongoing integration and timing misalignment at opening. Finally, by the time the metro's systems and station contracts were awarded in late 2022, the airport's landside access roads were already designed. This forced the project into expensive late-stage adjustments because the ground-level reality of the airport had been built before the metro's requirements were even locked in. There were significant challenges faced to the schedule management of the Western Sydney Airport construction due to the unprecedented environmental conditions. Moving 22 million cubic metres of earth is a massive logistical feat on a good day, but the project launched directly into 2 consecutive years of La Nina. Instead of the median 650 mils of rain, the site received over 1,000 millimetres annually. In a landscape where catchments were transitioning from 16 down to 5, the risk of sedimentation and site-wide washouts was extreme. To combat this, the joint venture moved beyond standard practices. They utilised monthly LiDAR drone surveys to map changing watersheds in real time. To protect the timeline, the team implemented aggressive schedule buffers and shifted to 24/7 work cycles during dry windows to recover lost time. Parallel to the weather, there was a second dual crisis faced: global supply chain and COVID-19 disruptions. This project primarily relied on just-in-time delivery to keep sites clear and lean. However, the pandemic made the model a liability for specialized terminal components, specifically the structured steel and highly complex automated baggage handling systems. The response was a fundamental shift in procurement strategy, moving from just-in-time to just-in-case. By securing early procurement and utilizing off-site storage, the project successfully decoupled delivery risks from the on-site construction sequence. This ensured that even when global logistics stalled, the terminal's critical path remained unblocked. By anticipating the silo effect of logistics, the team transformed a potential multi-month delay into manageable inventory exercise, keeping the 2026 opening date achievable. The Australian government established WSA Co. with an aggressive mandate: enter into $300 million worth of design and construction contracts within the first 12 months. This created a startup environment where the pace of procurement moved faster than the development of governmental framework. By the time the formal procurement manual was approved in late 2018, over $500 million across 124 contracts had already been committed. The ANAO audit identified 3 critical limitations caused by the schedule-first approach. Because the framework wasn't finalised, early procurement lacked a standardised value-for-money benchmark. Under pressure to meet milestones, record-keeping became fragmented. The audit found historical reviews, created in hindsight, and crucially, undated signatures on 55% on hand-signed contracts. This created a massive schedule accountability issue. If you can't prove when a decision was made, you can't prove it was ethical. To keep things moving quickly, the company initially set a $5 million threshold for open tenders. This was nearly 12 times higher than the Commonwealth benchmark, which limited market competition in those early critical months. The better approach isn't just about slowing down, it's about automating integrity. They implemented the Open Windows platform. This moved procurement from messy emails to a forced digital workflow where a contract cannot be signed without a digital timestamp and a mandatory value for money statement. This is a key scheduling assurance measure. The CEO and CFO led mandatory training to bridge gaps between knowing the policy and operationalizing it. Doing this would maximize schedule management. Consequently, governance must be the first milestone on the schedule, not a parallel activity. If this isn't included in the first critical task of the project, the continuation of the project would incur retrospective audits, which would cause significant delays. Finally, the Western Sydney International Airport revealed 2 critical takeaways that align directly with PMBOK's integration and schedule management standards. First, based on the requirements of the Western Sydney Airport, the PMBOK would necessitate a master schedule. The master schedule synchronizes internal airport packages with external dependencies like Transport for New South Wales and utility providers. Without this high-level integration, the project would face schedule clashes between stakeholders. Lastly, it has been demonstrated that true schedule management is about resilience planning, not just static tracking. As outlined in the Section 2.4 of the PMBOK 7th edition, this allowed them to model the combined effects of the individual's project risks and other sources of uncertainty to provide probability distribution of possible completion dates. The result of all of these efforts is a high-quality schedule management.
Hi, I'm Michael. Today I'll be reviewing the Western Sydney Airport project through the lens of stakeholder management. To link this back to the PIN box, stakeholder management is concerned with identifying the individuals, groups, and organizations that can affect or be affected by the project, and then planning, managing, and monitoring their engagement throughout the project lifecycle. For Western Sydney Airport, this is a particularly important knowledge area because this project is not just an engineering or construction challenge, it is also a social, environmental, and political challenge. The airport is designed to meet Sydney's future aviation demand, operate curfew-free, support passenger and freight service, and open in the second half of 2026. But those same project benefits also create major stakeholder concerns around aircraft noise, land use, environmental impact, First Nations heritage, transport access, and community trust. So in this section, I'll focus on three main points. Firstly, who are the key stakeholders? Secondly, where stakeholder management was successful? And thirdly, what were the limitations and how could have they been managed better? For a project of this scale, a simple list of stakeholders is not really enough. The project involved multiple layers of authority, influence, and had large community impact. At the highest level, the key decision-making stakeholders included the Australian Government, Transport for New South Wales, the Department of Infrastructure, the WSA Company, Air Service Australia, and other relevant agencies. These groups had high power because they controlled regulatory approval, airport delivery, flight path design, and most of the supporting infrastructure. The project also had major operational stakeholders, including airlines, freight companies, emergency services, Transport for New South Wales again, local councils, contractors, and the airport users themselves. These groups were important because the airport had to integrate with these services, the roads, utilities, airspace, and surrounding land use. However, the most sensitive stakeholder group was by far the community. This included residents near and around the airport, such as people in Badgerys Creek, residents under the future flight paths, the Blue Mountains Community Group, local businesses, environmental groups, and council representatives. The Flight Path EIS grouped stakeholders into categories such as government agencies, local MPs, local government, First Nations groups, aviation groups, business special interest groups, and communities at different distances from the airport. From a stakeholder management perspective, this is important because it shows that the community was not just a single group. A resident within 15 kilometers of the airport may have a very different concern to an airline, a freight operator, a council, or a Blue Mountains environmentalist group. A key success of the project was that the stakeholder engagement was not left completely informal. There were formal engagement structures created to link the community, government, and project organisations. For example, the Forum on the Western Sydney Airport, or FALSA, was used as the main forum connecting the community, the Australian Government, and the WSA Company during the construction. A separate Aboriginal stakeholder forum was also used to focus specifically on Aboriginal cultural heritage. This is a positive example of the PMBOK process, where planning stakeholder engagement because different stakeholders groups were not all treated in the same way. The project recognised that a general community forum was useful for broad project issues, while First Nations cultural heritage required a separate and more focused engagement pathway. Another strength was the level of engagement used during the airspace and flight path EIS. The EIS says that the engagement plan was informed by meetings with the government and aviation stakeholders through peer review workshops, the IAP2 engagement principles, desktop research, and lessons from other airport projects in Australia and around the world. It also included focus groups, community stalls, feedback sessions, briefings, interviews, and consultations with First Nation knowledge holders, residents, businesses, and community groups. So one of the clear strengths here is that the stakeholder management was treated as a structured process rather than one-off public relations. A second success was that stakeholder feedback appears to have influenced mitigation and monitoring measures, particularly around aircraft noise. The flight path process is a good example. The preliminary flight paths were authorised in June 25 after community consultation, and CASA approved the airspace change proposal in November 2025, with implementation planned for July 2026. The Minister also stated that preliminary flight paths had gone through more than 50 consultation sessions and received over 84,000 submissions to the draft EIS. As a result, the final EIS included changes intended to minimise aircraft noise, particularly overnight. This does not mean all stakeholders were satisfied and does not mean the noise impact disappeared, but it does show that consultation had some practical effect. For example, the government committed to measures such as prioritising reciprocal runway operation at night where safe to direct aircraft away from more heavily populated areas and reduce nighttime impacts. In project management terms, this is important because stakeholder engagement helped reduce implementation risk. It allowed the project team to identify concerns, explain technical constraints, convert some community feedback into operational mitigation. However, the project also faced unavoidable stakeholder trade-offs. The clearest example is the airport's curfew-free operation. From a national and economics perspective, curfew-free operations is a major benefit. It supports international passenger services, freight, airport capacity, and economic growth for the Western Sydney region. But from a local community perspective, it raises concerns about nighttime traffic noise, sleep disturbance, and long-term livability. This is where stakeholder management becomes more complex than simply communicating better. The conflict is partially built into the project itself. The same feature that benefits airlines, freight operators, and regional economic development can create negative impacts for residents under the flight paths. The EIS itself recognized the key community issues included in flight path location, individual community impacts, and environmental noise, 24-hour operations, and the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. It also noted that some people were skeptical about the integrity of consultation, partly because flight path design is so complex and there was a relatively short period between public exhibition and airport opening. So, one limitation is that the project could not manage all stakeholders simply by providing information. Some concerns required deeper involvement, clearer trade-off explanations, and visible evidence showing how community input changed project decisions. Another major limitation was the effect of governance and transparency issues on stakeholder trust. The strongest example is the Leppington Triangle land acquisition. The ANAO found that the Department of Infrastructure did not exercise appropriate due diligence in acquiring the land, and that aspects of the department's operations fell short of ethical standards. The ANO also found that the evaluation approach inflated the value of the land, causing the Australian government to pay far more than what was needed. This is clearly a cost and procurement issue, so it links somewhat with Mikhail's section, but it's also a stakeholder management issue because public trust is one of the foundations of stakeholder engagement. If the community sees weak due diligence, poor transparency, or unclear decision-making, then even technical valid decisions become harder to accept. A similar issue appeared in the WSA Code's early procurement framework. The ANAO found that the WSA Code was slow to develop its procurement framework, with significant procurement activity occurring before the framework was in place. It also found mixed compliance in 2017 and 2018, including inadequate record keeping, although the WSA later improved its framework. The key lesson is that stakeholder management is not only about town halls and information sessions, it also depends on governance, ethical decision making, and record keeping and transparent reporting. Improvement could have been made through a more transparent and adaptive stakeholder engagement system across the whole project lifecycle. First, the project should have used live stakeholder register that is updated at each major phase: land acquisition, construction, flight path development, commissioning, etc. Second, the project should combine a power interest grid with a salience model. The power interest grid is useful for identifying those who need close management but can understand the importance of grids with low formal authority. Third, the project should use a public "you said we did" or "why not" register. This would show which community suggestions were adopted and which were not, and why. Finally, there should be a strong interface between governance, airports, the airport facility, flight path, road, rail, infrastructure, and more. Overall, my main conclusion is that the stakeholder management was both a strength and a weakness of the Western Sydney Airport project. It was a strength due to the project creating a formal engagement channels, identifying a wide range of stakeholders, and using community feedback to shape and mitigate measures and impacts around the project. But it was also a weakness because trust and transparency issues created reputational risk and caused stakeholder concern that were difficult to resolve due to the basic trade-offs built into the project. A curfew-free airport may have been viable at the national regional level, but it still creates real local impacts that must be acknowledged and managed. The key project management learning is that the stakeholder management should not be treated as a soft or secondary activity. For mega projects like the WSA, stakeholder management is a control system for legitimacy, risk, communication, and long-term acceptance. This also links back to the rest of our presentation. Cost management, schedule management, and scope management all depend on stakeholder support. The stakeholders lose trust, then approvals, procurement, design decisions, communications, and long-term operations can become hindered.
Hello, my name is Adrian, and today I'll be reviewing scope management as a project management body of knowledge, diving into the case project, the Western Sydney Airport, which is a particularly useful project to analyse because its scope has evolved continuously over more than 70 years, from the early planning concepts in the late 1940s. But wait, before we look at the project itself, it's important to define a few key terms in project management. Scope, referring to the work required to successfully deliver a project, outlining what outcomes are expected and the boundaries of the work being completed. Scope statement, a more detailed and formal document, outlining specific deliverables, technical requirements, milestones, and project objectives. Controlled scope evolution, usually positive because it's predictive, to adapt to future needs, regulations, or technological improvements. Uncontrolled scope creep, usually negative due to being unexpected, increases complexity, cost, or delays. The Western Sydney Airport demonstrates both of these concepts extremely well. Early airport plans from the 40s and 50s were relatively vague, having no fixed site, no start date, little environmental consideration, and little long-term infrastructure planning. Over the following decades, the project scope expanded significantly through repeated site investigations, environmental regulation increases, stakeholder concerns, future-proofing requirements, and broader infrastructure planning. The timeline on the screen shows how investigation and site selection studies continued across multiple decades, with locations and project requirements regularly changing before construction finally commencing in the 2020s. These continual changes make the Western Sydney Airport an excellent example of how major infrastructure project scope can evolve over time. Another major factor influencing the scope evolution of the Western Sydney Airport project was environmental and regulatory expansion. In the early planning stages during the 40s and 50s, environmental considerations were far less regulated than they are today. Modern infrastructure projects now require extensive environmental impact statements, or EIS reports, before construction can proceed. These reports investigate a wide range of factors, including biodiversity, Aboriginal cultural heritage, soil conditions, air quality, noise pollution, etc. All of these studies increase project complexity, increase planning time, and significantly expand the scope of the project compared to earlier airport proposals. For this presentation, I'll focus specifically on noise pollution as a detailed example from the EIS. The images shown here are examples taken from the EIS for the Western Sydney Airport project. These studies model expected aircraft noise levels surrounding the proposed runway locations and surrounding communities. This is important because aircraft generate extremely high noise levels, especially during takeoff and landing. As shown in the chart here to the right, aircraft noise is significantly louder than normal background and environmental noise. This creates competing stakeholder interests. Local communities generally prefer stricter noise controls and curfews to reduce disturbance, particularly during nighttime hours. However, government planners, airport operators, and international businesses strongly preferred the Western Sydney Airport to operate without a curfew, especially since the Kingsford Smith Airport is already operating with an overnight curfew. As a result, detailed noise analysis becomes a critical part of the planning process. These environmental studies directly influence runway placement, airport location, operational planning, and long-term infrastructure decisions. Compared to the original conceptual airport proposals from the 40s and 50s, the project scope has expanded significantly through environmental regulation, operational planning, and future-proofing requirements. Originally, the project was simply focused on constructing an additional airport for Sydney, but today, the scope has evolved to include detailed environmental investigations, long-term noise modelling, and operational planning designed to avoid future curfew restrictions. This represents controlled scope evolution because planners are intentionally expanding the project scope to improve long-term airport operation and reduce future operational risk. Another major factor that expanded the scope of the Western Sydney Airport project was site selection and long-term infrastructure planning. Over the decades, multiple site selection studies were conducted, with locations such as Wilton and Badgerys Creek being considered. However, it became clear that an airport cannot operate as an isolated structure. Passengers and freight companies need access to roads, rail networks, buses, hotels, rental vehicles, and nearby businesses. Because of this, the project scope expanded beyond simply building a runway and a terminal. The airport also needed to support future economic growth and connect efficiently to Sydney's existing transport and commercial systems. Compared to more remote locations like Wilton, the Badgerys Creek site provided a better balance between accessibility and operational flexibility. It also reduced the likelihood of future curfew restrictions while remaining connected to major infrastructure networks. This is a strong example of controlled scope evolution. Over time, the project naturally expanded from the idea of building a second airport into a much larger infrastructure and urban planning project involving transport, logistics, and long-term development across Western Sydney. In conclusion, the Western Sydney Airport is an excellent case study project for project scope management because its scope changed significantly over more than 70 years of planning and development. Environmental regulations, noise management, site selection, and future infrastructure planning all contributed to major scope changes over time. Overall, the project demonstrates how large infrastructure projects evolve from simple early concepts into highly complex systems involving transport, environmental management, and long-term urban development.
Having now reviewed the PMBOK areas, we can move on to the main takeaways for the entire project. Over the multiple areas reviewed, there was a number of overlapping points that were identified. The project clearly identified long-term economic impact, including the cost of inaction, which applied across schedule, scope, and cost management, early land acquisition, which led to timely schedule delivery and scope constraint while also mitigating possible expenses, and a correct early forecasting of the increased passenger demand, which related to cost and schedule. The project, however, also lacked in specific areas, where administrative shortcuts were taken, leading to a misvaluation and internal mismanagement affecting the cost, schedule, and scope. The initial project also stagnated and dragged on for decades due to the expanding requirements impacting the schedule and scope heavily, while there was also prevalent inconsistency with project updates and reporting to the public and decision makers, leading to broadly applicable effects.